Good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Borden, Moment Magazine Zoominar producer, and I want to welcome you to our celebration of the winners of the 2021 Moment Magazine Karma Foundation Short Fiction Contest, and to thank you for joining us for our conversation, Everything is Material, the Influence of Love, Loss, and Humor in Fiction and Memoir. We are delighted to welcome our contest winners and this year's judge, author Susan Coll, to this special literary event. It is also my pleasure to welcome author Delia Efren, who will be in conversation with Susan and Moment Book and Opinion editor Amy E Schwartz in just a little bit. To start the program, it is my pleasure to introduce Sharon Karmazin, an award-winning Broadway producer, a member of Moment's advisory board, and the president of the Karma Foundation, which makes this contest and this very event possible. Sharon?
I'm delighted to welcome you to this literary afternoon. When we launched this contest in 2000, our goal was to give unpublished writers a place where their work could be exposed. Over the years, it has been an incredible experience to get to know these creative and talented people. Many have gone on to publish short stories, anthologies, and novels. Their work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Tablet, Haaretz, Plowshares, Tikkun, and many other publications. They have won prestigious fellowships and all kinds of awards. We are particularly thrilled to let you know that last year's winner, Omer Friedlander's book, The Man Who Sold Air in the Holy Land, was published by Random House in April. It's a short story collection you won't want to miss. It's received great reviews. Moment has published a wonderful collection of some of these award-winning stories in an ebook called Good Karma. These are the stories that have been winners in our contest. Everyone today can access this ebook free of charge from the shop page on Moment's website by using the code KARMA, all lowercase, K-A-R-M-A. Today, it's my pleasure to announce the winners of the 2021 Moment Contest, Karma Foundation Short Fiction, and to thank Susan Coll, Suzanne Borden for their work on this year's contest. Our first place winner is Schott, and her story is Why Is There a Buddhist at this Seder? Our second place winner is Hillel Damron for his story Calculated Moves. Anne's story was published in the spring issue of Moment Magazine. Hillel's story is upcoming in another issue coming soon. And you won't want to miss either of these stories. I urge all of the writers out there to enter this contest. This year's deadline is August 15th. Check our website for more information. Anne and Hillel, congratulations. Your awards will be mailed to you. We are delighted to have you with us today to read excerpts from your stories. It's my pleasure to invite Susan Coll, this year's contest judge, to introduce the winners. Susan?
Thank you so much, Sharon. It's an honor to be judging this contest, and I'd like to begin by introducing Hillel Damron. Calculated Moves by Hillel Damron is the poignant, affecting story of aging in the time of COVID. The protagonist, an elderly occupant of a Jewish retirement center, believes he has become part tree. Resentful of his son and daughter-in-law for forcing him to move into this new living arrangement after observing his forgetfulness, as well as after a recent fall, the narrator considers his new home an asylum, self-identifying as an inmate rather than a resident. His struggles with the onset of dementia blend lyrically into the realm of magical realism, creating a moving and memorable story. Congratulations, Hillel.
Calculated move. He turned away and began to walk, taking small steps and walking very slowly, unsteadily, in the long corridor towards the stairs. It was all about calculated moves for him now. Execution. Think before you move. Execution. Look straight ahead, never sideways. Execution. Don't fall, since you'll never be able to get up again. Execution. Don't get distracted. as you normally do. The first destruction came fast though. The ceiling was too low, the tree was too high. And as he was walking, passing by fellow residents' doors, the top branches of the tree were sweeping the dust off the ceiling. White powder was falling on him like soft snow, bidding him farewell. His heart was pounding rapidly, either from the exertion of walking with a tree up on his head, or from the worry that someone would pass by and see him, or would open a door suddenly. But no one did. He was able to sneak out of the building through a side door undetected. He stood for a moment there, free at last, and breathed the fresh, chilly air outside with deep, sensuous pleasure. He stepped closer to his nearby garden plot, feeling bad for the neglect all around, when the second destruction appeared. His cat, a stray one, who'd adopted resident GP following the death of his old cat 2 years ago. The cat, a whitish female, apparently didn't hold his long absence against him. Oblivious to the pandemic, she had been waiting for him all this time to return, knowing full well that eventually he would. He couldn't lean down to stroke her, but the cat did her thing, brushing against his feet and ankles, meowing. The cat's name was Luba. He had named her after a woman he met and fallen in love with on that old kibbutz. Rather beautiful she was, even exotic, with curly brown hair and single skin when he was there. He thought about her now, fighting this painful third destruction, and what might have happened had he been more persistent in pursuing her. Had he stayed there in the kibbutz longer, instead of going back to Jerusalem to complete his studies at the Hebrew University. He would never know, would he, what kind of love, what kind of life the two of them might have had the chance to create and share. But he'd opened the gate and left that small village, just as he did now, leaving the building and walking into the street. She followed him, Luba the cat, as well as that painful memory of Luba the woman, the last woman he would remember.
Thank you, Hillel. It's always a pleasure to hear you read, because we read these stories without names attached. So it's just so interesting to see who the winners are and to hear them read their words. I'd now like to introduce our winner, Anne Schott. Like all good fiction, Why Is There a Buddhist at the Seder operates on multiple levels. On the surface, this is a funny, sharply observed story of a single Passover Seder and its various shades of barely contained family dysfunction. From the traffic on the Long Island Expressway to the quality of wine to the changes in the new Haggadah, the story covers familiar Seder tropes. Read on a deeper level, however, it captures the subtle conflicts of family, sibling tension, generational disconnect, and judgments about the choices that we make on matters of faith and on the way we live our lives. Congratulations, Anne.
Why is there a Buddhist at this Seder? This is a wonderful meal, B. Martin said when everyone was seated and food again became the center of attention. Enjoy, B said. She never ate much at these meals. She merely tasted a bite of this and that to make sure everything was all right. Her pleasure came from seeing her family fill their plates. She kept her eyes off those that held only tofu and asparagus. Was that food for growing boys? How could a nice piece of chicken hurt them? I don't know what you said while I was in the kitchen, Rachel began, but you seem to be criticizing Judaism because it's life-affirming. I'm not criticizing Judaism, David said. I'm criticizing what I see as a deep indifference to what religion is all about. And you know what that is? Lots of people know. It's not a secret. Ugh, David, Sam said, shaking his head. For all your years in Sabbath school and all those bar mitzvah classes, you never understood Judaism. There's a lot more than theology here. There's history and a living tradition and a commitment to an ethical life, to repairing the world. Rachel's voice trembled with emotion. David studied the little pile of matzah crumbs by the side of his plate, searching for a way through what seemed impenetrable barriers. They cared about being Jewish, but not about the questions religion illuminated. Do you believe in God? He asked Rachel. Yes, of course. And what do you mean by that? For a moment, she stared at him angrily. God is the ruling spirit of the universe, she said. That's what I believe. And the ruling spirit of the universe permitted the Holocaust? In the silence that followed, even David thought he had gone too far. Passover was a happy occasion, and the faces around the table suddenly darkened. It's a terrible question, Sam said. Serious questions are often terrible, David said. That's why you have to ask them. Ellen didn't like the pained look on Sam's face or David's foolish persistence. For some people, these questions were real, she thought. For others, they didn't exist, and you'd think a psychologist would understand that. Is everyone ready for dessert? He asked, rising from the table. Ellen, will you bring the tea? As always, the Seder meal ended with Bee's famous strawberry applesauce and large slices of golden sponge cake, treats that quickly changed the mood. Oh, I ate too much, Martin said, but everything was delicious, Bee, as always. The wine was good too, David. I bought it at a little shop in Selborne, David said. Ah, write down the name, Sam said, so we'll remember for next year.
We want to thank our winners, Anne Schott and Hillel Damron, and we want to thank Susan for judging our contest this year. It is now my pleasure to introduce our guests who are going to share their thoughts about the influence of love, loss, and humor in fiction and memoir. Susan Coll is an author as well as president of the Penn-Faulkner Foundation. Her novels include The Stager, a New York Times and Chicago Tribune editor's choice, and Acceptance, which was made into a television movie starring actress Joan Cusack. Her work has appeared in many publications, including the New York Times Book Review, The Washington Post, Washingtonian Magazine, Moment Magazine, NPR.org, and TheAtlantic.com. Susan teaches the Novel Year program at the Writers Center and is part of the events team at Politics and Prose Bookstore. Susan served as this year's Moment Magazine Karma Foundation Short Fiction Contest Judge. Her sixth novel, Bookish People, will be published in August. Delia Efren is a novelist, screenwriter, essayist, and playwright. Her novels include best-selling Syracusa, and her books of essays and humor include How to Eat Like a Child. Her many movie credits, co-written with her sister Nora Efren, include You've Got Mail, Michael, and Hanging Up, based on her novel. Delia's writing has been published in the New York Times, Vogue, and Vanity Fair. She is part of the Empathy Project, a collaboration of doctors and filmmakers who create films to teach empathy to doctors. Delia is author of the recently published best-selling memoir, Left on 10th, A Second Chance at Life. Amy E Schwartz is Moment Magazine's opinion and book editor, as well as editor of the magazine's popular Ask the Rabbi section. Before coming to Moment, Amy was a longtime editorial writer and op-ed columnist at the Washington Post, where she was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in commentary. Amy is president of the Non-Denominational Jewish Studies Center in Washington, D.C., and is the editor of the book, Can Robots Be Jewish? And Other Pressing Questions of Modern Life. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone to write any questions you have for our speakers in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many as possible at the end of the conversation. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Susan Coll, Delia Efren, and Amy E. Schwartz.
Hi everybody, welcome, and welcome to everyone on Zoom, and welcome both of you. And let me just say what a pure, total pleasure it's been preparing for this conversation by going back and reading your novels and memoirs. I've rarely spent a more enjoyable week. I wanted to start with a quote from your new memoir, Delia, Left on 10th, where which, among other things, is a memoir of your illness. And it's in this scene, you're in the middle of a truly horrendous medical treatment, a bone marrow transplant for leukemia. And you text this doctor, who's a continuing character in the memoir, who's been a mainstay, and she kind of reminds you of your sisters, Dr. Robaz. So you text her saying, it's a particular kind of hell to come back from this, weakness and fear and trauma. And Dr. Robaz writes back to you, quote, "You will bounce back strong and fit and fabulous, and then write the best screenplay ever, and Julia Roberts will play me." So I thought that was a good place to start because for our theme, everything is material, because it seems to me that one of the things that both of you are best known for and what you're so good at is, first of all, you take the shapeless stuff of life and turn it into stories. And then you also take the bitterest, scariest stuff and turn it into comedy. And, once something's a story, for some reason, everybody seems to love it. So let me ask a big, obvious question to start off. How do you know when something that happens to you is going to make a great story? Where do you go from there?
Oh, Susan, do you want to start that?
Sure. Well, let me also just begin by thanking everybody and echoing Amy. Delia, it was such a pleasure for me to just sit on the porch for really 3 days straight reading your memoir, which is really remarkable, just the way that it's manages to be so uplifting at the same time that it's really harrowing, and it really deeply affected me. I've been reaching out to all of my friends who I'd sort of lost touch with, and a reminder of just friendship and life and joy. But now I will answer the question. For me, it's usually when something difficult that I've been kind of chewing over in my mind or fretting over, worrying over, begins to seem funny. That's really, I don't really set out to write comedy, but it seems to be my way of processing the world and processing difficult situations. So, all of my books have been characterized as comedy, but there's always really a dark thread running through each book. So,
really violent things happen in some of your novels. Big disasters.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a foreboding in your books. I've just started the stager and I can feel it already. Well, for me, I was the funny one in the family. I was that kid. So I think some of this is just genetically you come out as, your gene, whatever your gene pool is, it has that thing that is funny. But I also, I had this, a very, very lovely childhood till I was about 11. And my mother was she was a writer, and she just wanted her daughters to be writers. And every time I said something funny, my dad shouted, "That's a great line, write it down." I would say something at dinner and he would say, "That's a title, write it down." So I had titles before I had books. And so I was very much, and we told stories at dinner, and I think I was primed, but my comedy was also primed. And then when I was 11, my parents just tipped over into a very severe alcoholism. And I tell you, it was almost like a curtain falling on the house. It wasn't like it was there before. It was a very sudden shift. And I had a very difficult adolescence because I never slept at night because my parents were just maniacs, screaming. It was very difficult, and difficult on all of us in the family. The kids, there were four sisters, were all writers. And I think that took my comedy and gave it tragedy and my talent. And so I think I have this ability to go, when you're a writer, you start to understand what your gifts are, and then you start to mine them, because that's part of understanding what it is to write or to have talent. And I understood very quickly that my comedy had a dark side, and that I had to keep things, as a writer, if you're going to go dark, you have to always keep it real in the, in the comedy. So I always know how far I can go this way and that. I'm sure, I mean, Dr. Robos wrote that. Dr. Robos is very, very, has a great sense of language. It's one of the reasons I loved her as my doctor. And when I was writing that book and I was going through all the emails she sent me and all the texts, I just, I mean, there it was. There's the character. I mean, you just nailed it. So,
yeah. I noticed in one of your memoirs, you talk about how when you first broke through with your own voice, it was with this little piece for the Times called How to Eat Like a Child, which sounds like a little bit of that same theme, like it's light, but it speaks to family dynamics. Or
it's actually, that book, How to Eat Like a Child, is an adult book. It was a very successful book, but it was not, it's wicked. And I was wanting to be a writer. I had enough money to last a year, and I was eating chocolate pudding one night my way. And I noticed that I was, making a hole in the skin and scooping the pudding out underneath. And I noticed my friend was eating it another way. And I said, oh my God, I'm eating like a child. She's eating like a child. And I had written a crochet book, so I knew how to write directions. So I just adapted them to this thing. I mean, it was a very magical experience for me because I wanted to be a writer, and that piece, 500 words, I got a book contract the next morning. I had a career. I was like, people were phoning me, everybody was listed in the phone book then. Anyway, people were phoning me from everywhere. It was, the New York Times got so much mail on that piece that they said it was like the only thing that got more mail than that was Israel, they said. So, I wrote that and I suddenly thought, oh, that's your voice. I heard what my gift was. It was the first time. I think, Susan, does that happen to you where there was one thing you wrote when you started out that sort of told you who you were?
Yes and no. I'm thinking back to the first novel that I published. I have one that never made it, but the first one that was published, also going back to the dark comedy, was inspired by learning that Karl Marx had a daughter named Eleanor who had committed suicide. And I thought I was writing a historical novel about the Marx family and about Eleanor. And when we went to shop it, every editor who saw it said, this is really funny. Can you pump up the comic pieces? So I think that's how I've discovered my voice. I've resisted that a bit. I still do. I wish I was writing gorgeous literary fiction, and I always try to start off that way, and that's not my voice and it doesn't work. And then eventually I find the comedy again. So sort of trial and error.
I don't think you should feel less than because of that. I think that's a real gift, to be able to find that. No matter what you're going through, you have that ability to see what's funny at any given moment. I don't know. It's a lovely.
Well, thank you for saying that. And, I'm starting, 20 years later to appreciate that, and largely through reading other very, very funny authors and realizing that it's not as easy to do as it might seem.
Mm-hmm. What's that first novel called? KarlMarx.com or something like that?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, that's such a great title.
For the benefit of the listeners, I thought, they should know what it's called.
Yes, that is it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me flip this question around and ask something probably equally obvious. Susan, in a profile of you say that when you left politics and prose, although I guess not permanently, when you stopped working in the bookstore, you promised them that your next novel would not be a comic novel about an independent bookstore, which of course, when Bookish People comes out and other people have the pleasure, they'll see that's exactly what it is. And on a more serious note, I guess, Delia, one of your essays, one of your most affecting chapters in the previous memoir is called "Why I Can't Write About My Mother," So let me flip that around and say, when do you tell yourself, no, this is not material? And then what happens to change your mind about that?
Well, as to the bookstore piece, which Brad Graham, one of the co-owners of the bookstore, just reminded me of 2 days ago, I did in fact say that, and the entire time I worked there in my first incarnation, I left for a number of years and I just came back. I had no intention of writing a novel set in an independent bookstore. I really didn't. And to me, it was just a job. And I took a leave of absence. It turned into a very long leave of absence. And they didn't take me off the email distribution list for about a year. I did keep saying, you might want to take me off this, but I noticed at least once a week, there was a long memo about the vacuum cleaner being broken. And it just finally seemed so funny. It was like a message to me that this vacuum cleaner wanted to be part of a comic novel. And that's how it came to be. So, as to the larger question of how when it's time, I'm eager to hear Delia's answer, because I'm still wrestling with that myself, with certain material, things I've written that I don't know whether I can try to publish or not. So it's hard to know.
I don't really think there's almost nothing I've wanted to write that I haven't just gone and written. I think I think there were times, I don't think I could have written that piece about my mother, which I think is one of the best pieces I've ever written, because I couldn't get a grip on her, and I couldn't get a grip on her for years. And I think, and I needed to understand the essay, how to write an essay in a much more sophisticated way to do that piece also. I mean, I didn't have the skill set even to do it, much less understand it. But I think, my mother said to me one day when I was 11 or 12, no, I was about 14, I was reading in the sunroom, and she walked in after some horrible night of screaming with my father, and she says, "I hope you never tell anyone what happens here." Mm-hmm. And I grew up and I realized, tell everyone, because you will never get past it otherwise. It's how you will process it. Tell everyone. You don't keep the secrets of your parents. That's not your job. Your parents are supposed to protect you in life. They're not supposed to expose you to that level of terror. And if you have an ability to write that, to help someone else as well as yourself, you have to write it well. And you have to write it with an attempt to understand, but tell everyone. I didn't understand that when I was little, but I began to understand that as I got older, that in a way, it's how you can process trauma. That's not why I write it, by the way. I don't write to process trauma, although Left on 10th, which took me through the loss of my late husband, Jerry, and then falling in love and then getting diagnosed with AML, and which is a fierce leukemia. I thought after that, after going through a bone marrow transplant, I would never write again. I couldn't even stand up, much less with my brain working. But in the end, when I did write it, it got me to the other side. So writing can get you somewhere very special. And if you're a dancer, you can dance it there. You can paint it there. If you're a painter, you can sew it. If you're a sewer, these options are open. If you have them, do them. That's what I think. And don't shy away from it.
There's a wonderful line in, first of all, I'd have to agree that essay about your mother is incredibly affecting. And you end by saying, I can't write about her because I just don't know who she was, which is, after this long struggling essay to figure out who she was. But there's a funnier version of the same thing where you talk about the first job you had, where you walk out, you finally say to the manager, I quit, and he insults you. and he says something insulting, and you say, "This is my favorite thing that's ever happened to me because I love telling people this story." I mean, it's sort of the purest idea of revenge, right?
Yeah. I walked out. This guy was such a nasty guy. And I said, I quit. I walk out and he yells, "You're flat chested." Okay. And I just could not, I mean, I was so stunned. I didn't have an answer then, obviously. But it has been one of my favorite stories ever since because, I mean, I always joke that I was unemployed and flat chested. So what did I do? I became a writer. That was the beginning of my career, actually. But yeah, almost everything can be spun. But the thing of writing about my mother, I mean, it really took years for me to dig that deep. Whereas that comment he made was about my becoming a writer, really.
Sure. Tell the story, right? Get it.
Yeah, tell the story. And also I hadn't become a writer until then. And it was because I was unemployed
Right.
that I began to do it.
I'm curious, this sort of comes up this has probably come up a little bit in what we've said already, but I know there are writers who, especially writers who do both fiction and memoir, who go back and forth, who they kind of find themselves telling the same story over and over in different forms. And I mean, you said it took you years to sort of get to the point where you could write the story about your mother. Do either of you find that you're returning to the same story and then it comes out differently, either based on the form or, for some other reason?
I don't. Susan, do you?
No,
I
mean,
think
yeah, it's a good question because maybe I do in ways that I'm not aware of, but I can't say that I am offhand.
You feel like once you've done the story, you're onto something new.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certain themes that I probably stick to. I think I'm writing a little bit about class and, class. I'm not sure, but I would say that is one common thread or one thing I feel like I am keenly observant about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we've been talking as if the fiction and memoir are kind of in separate buckets. And I want to go back and ask about the line between them. I was struck, Susan, in your book Beach Week, there's actually a character who's a victim of what I guess is known as autofiction, where you write something that's not true, but you use the true names, and it sort of appears to be a memoir, but it's really not. And there's this poor guy whose wife. Well, I'll let you tell it. But I mean, what do you think of that? What do you think about the line?
Yeah, it's funny. That's very observant, Amy. I almost forgot that of everything I've written. I do a very diligent job of disguising characters and not really using real characters, just having that be inspiration. But I would say Beach Week was the one that came closest to the bone, because this whole absurd situation that we as parents found ourselves in, just the rough idea of it is there is this thing across the country, but especially in the Washington area, called Beach Week, where as a rite of passage of high school graduation, kids go to the beach, and it's kind of a sanctioned week of debauchery. And I was sort of shocked as a parent to suddenly be invited to all of these meetings about how our kids were going to behave at Beach Week. And, there was a rental contract on this house that we were all going to sign our lives away by signing this document that our children would behave at Beach Week. And one of the people in the parent group is a lawyer, and he drew up this contract, and just the absurdity of this situation almost wanted to be, in my mind, just recorded and turned into a novel. And yeah, I still, when I see this parent group, which isn't very often, I'm a little bit nervous, but they were all very generous about it. And I did have a lawyer go through the book. So yeah, that would be the one that was closest. But, then we had only a few years later, the Brett Kavanaugh hearings with the word Speech Week, in all caps in the New York Times. And some of the stories I'd heard about Beach Week were taken from the school he attended. So it really did feel like art imitating life, imitating art, whatever.
Mm-hmm. But then there's that character who's actually turned into a character in the book by his wife, who writes a novel in which he features as a peeping Tom right? And then he insists he's not, that wasn't really him. It was just a novel his wife wrote. It seemed like you were playing with what you were doing while you were doing it.
Yeah. There's a lot of layers there of metafiction.
Right. I mean, you create this place, Verona County, which I guess is easily recognizable as a Washington suburb. But so would you say most of those books do seem to come quite close to somebody's life? I mean, is that an issue at all? Or?
It hasn't been because, as I said, I'm really not, I am not somebody looking to skewer anybody or, I don't have any vendettas. So I'm really just taking the material as inspiration and never writing about real characters. Beach Week is the one that might have come closest, but that's just because that legal contract was a little too precious to not try to capture in words. But no, there's never been a problem so far, knock wood.
Delia, what about you? I mean, I know some of, like, at least one novel, at least two of the novels I've read seem very far from anything that would be like your life. Like the Lion novel, The Lion is In, appears like a
Right.
I wouldn't consider that anywhere near the memoir line, but what about in general?
I think the first novel a person writes is often autobiographical, and mine was about, about my family. It's about the death of the father, and my father used to call me every second. And one day he said to me, I said, Dad, it's like the fifth or sixth phone call. It was only like 3 p.m, and I said, oh my God, Dad, you're calling so much. And he said, I live half my life in the real world and half on the telephone, which, by the way, is what most people do right now. But anyway, at that moment, I knew what the subject of, I had never written a novel, but I knew that was the subject of my novel, which was called Hanging Up. And it's about the death of a father. And it's about 3 sisters, and it's about sibling relationships. It was, and I really thought, because this is my first novel, go to what you know. I mean, it's the safest place. There's so much you don't understand about how to write a novel. It's so difficult, at least I think so, that if you are at least in territory that you understand in your gut, like a father-daughter relationship and my sibling relationships, which was so powerful, then I knew I was at least on solid ground there, where everything else was going to be very difficult. But from then on, my books really just were things that happened to me in a weird way. And my novels, and The Lion is In, which takes place in North Carolina in a bar with 3 women and a lion. I was dealing with the death of my husband, and with Nora being sick as well. And I thought, they were both sick. It was when they were both sick. And I was so frightened. And I said, how am I going to get through this? And I went to sleep and I had a dream. And the dream was of these 3 women in a bar in North Carolina. I'd never even been to North Carolina. And I woke up and I knew the title, The Lion is In, and I knew I had a book to write. And it was quite joyful to write it. It took a while to get it right enough to get it published, but it was really an amazing experience. And after I wrote it, still never having gone to North Carolina, and my writer girlfriends are always saying to me, you can't write a book without going there, which is true. And so I got on a plane and went down there, and I found things that I had written, very strange things. I found a tree that's very important in the book, a tree that's been struck by lightning in the middle of a field with all its foliage sheared off. And I was just driving around to random places, and I made this turn, and there in the field was a tree.
Wow.
And I screamed, and I was with my niece, who was a college student then, and we stopped the car, and we just, like, I could not believe I had written something that existed, or that I found it, or anything like that. And then I went to somebody's house because I wanted to see what the inside of my character's house might look like, Clayton's house. And we answered an ad on the wall of a Mexican restaurant, and we went to buy sweet rolls at this woman's house. And we chatted with her, and her husband came home. And in my book, the man who owns the Lion has a vintage Chevy Bel Air convertible, as well as the Lion. Those are his two main things. And when we left the house, that man had been driving a vintage Chevy. It was parked in front of the house, the exact car that I wrote.
Wow.
Gorgeous, with the top down and the orange interior. And I mean, and honestly, that book altered my brain completely, because I still can't explain. I don't know how to process it at all. And so that was that book. And then the other book, I was in Syracuse, my other novel, with another couple. We weren't getting along that great. Okay. And Syracuse is this amazing place. It's just all stone. I mean, the Romans knocked all the trees down at the turn at sometime in BC, and they just paved the place. So it's this magical stone preserved place. And the first day I was there, I thought, this is the most gorgeous place I've ever been. And the second day I thought, if I don't get out of here, I'm going to go mad. And I knew immediately it was a book about marriage, and that it was going to be set in Syracuse. And I mean, it was like, it just came at me. And I think if you were a novelist, I'm sure this happens to Susan too, that, you know, your book can land on you in a way like that. It took me many years to write it. I had to go back to Syracuse a whole bunch of times. I had very good luck in who I met there. And I was but the book became everything I understood about marriage. I do not think I could have written it when I was younger. I needed to be older and smarter and more psychological. And I think marriage is fantastic, but it's a complete madness. So I had this shrink that said to me, 2 people falling in love across a crowded room is just 2 neuroses spotting their perfect neurotic match. And I never forgot it, but I do think it has some truth to marriage in that. So that came out of that. So all I'm saying is these novels can find you in a way from your experiences in life. But when I began with what I knew, what I had grown up understanding.
That's a very interesting, that story about the lion is in and the tree, like, do you make anything? What do you make of that? I mean,
I truly don't, you know, and I'm married now to a Jungian, which is a follower of Carl Jung, a psychiatrist, and they believe in confluence and things that can happen in life that you can't really explain. They believe that the subconscious is a source of creativity, or they don't call it sub, they call it unconscious. They either call it subconscious, they call it unconscious. I think it's the unconscious, right. There's no subconscious.
Sub's close to the surface, right? On is down there.
Anyway, so, I mean, it's, you know, in that world, things can happen in the world of the Jungians, but I truly, I don't know what to make of it. You know, I'm not religious. I do not know how I found that tree, and I don't know how I found that car. I really don't. And I think there are things in life that you don't understand, that can never be explained to you, and that science can't explain them. That's for sure. So I don't know. It was very profound, and it had to do with novel writing. It had to do with my imagination.
That is, yeah, and it's a sort of a magical fable too. The story. I mean, as it reads.
Yeah, it is. It's very unlike anything I've ever written. It's quite mad. It's quite a fable. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So has that happened to you, Susan? Do your novels like fall on you?
Yeah, I mean, that was really interesting to hear, Delia. I do believe in the confluence concept, although I couldn't articulate it especially well. But the similar experience I've had of that is more to do with kind of visualization that I also probably can't articulate very well, but I feel like I've just have these images in my head that help me through a novel. And with the most recent one, it took me a while to get this book right. And then it took me a while to sell it, in part because COVID hit just as it had gone out and no one was reading anything, no one was returning emails, and I was kind of despairing about the whole thing. But the solar eclipse plays a role in this novel, as it does remarkably in Delia's memoir, as also does in Aga, which is really strange.
We should talk about that more. Go on.
Yeah. But I kept having the image in my mind of the solar eclipse as we filtered it through a colander, and we're standing on our porch. We were in Vermont, and I could just see those little crescents, and had a strange day where I'd been in the woods and I'd seen a bear, and then I'd stumbled across a little bizarre display of gnomes that somebody had stuck in a tree, and just kind of the magic of all three of those things in one day in my mind. I was just carrying that around as the novel. It's also about Charlottesville, so it's very dark, but then it had this kind of lightness to it. So I don't know how that really helped me write the novel, but I carried that around in my mind, and I find that true to some extent about my personal life, even my sort of, not to detour too much off the topic, but I recently remarried, and as I was thinking about how I wanted my life to look, I could sort of see exactly what I stumbled into. So the kind of just lots of dogs and big yard and blended family. And so I think there is something to like visualizing what you want or what you want to write and letting that help guide.
Listening to it when it comes to
Yeah.
It's interesting. I do want you guys to talk about the eclipse and the Aga, because I do think that's really quite funny. Susan and I, before you came on, Delia, we were talking about how you could take two bodies of work, even seemingly dissimilar, and there's going to be some weird overlap, and this seems to be it. So the eclipse. So you also write about the eclipse, right?
Yes, I do. It was just a profound experience. I'm not surprised you described that day as being very meaningful. I was when I was in remission, and Peter's huge. He's big on sky and stars, and he'd already booked. He'd known for years. I mean, I guess people have followed these things, so he'd booked in this little motel, which was 2 hours from totality in Western Oregon, Eastern Oregon. And to sit there on this football field, we were in Baker City, and to watch the color just drain out of the grass and the sky, and then over this, and then you're looking through those crazy glasses, and there's this, the moon is 7,000 miles in diameter, and the sun, and has no light of its own, and the sun is 800,000 miles in diameter, and its radiance lights the world, and for 90 seconds the moon blocks out the sun. I mean, what could be? I mean, for me, it was me versus the mighty leukemia, but it was, this phenomenal thing that had been happening for centuries. Imagine what it was like when there were no, when no one understood astronomy. I mean, imagine suddenly all the light disappears in the middle of the day. And anyway, I thought it was just so extraordinary and life affirming, and made me sort of understand my place in the world a little bit better, Yeah.
So now you have to talk about the Aga, and then I'll ask Susan too.
The Aga. Well, the Aga, I mean, I don't know, Susan, do you have an Aga? My best friend in Wales has an Aga, and I'm fascinated by it. It seems to heat the whole house as far as I can tell. And it has all these, I mean, it's just the most gigantic stove. and the ovens are always on and the burners are always on, and you kind of cook by moving the pots around, so that, I mean, if you wanted to boil, you put it on one burner. If you wanted to simmer, you move it to another. I mean, it's kind of like this. It's a dance. I think it's fantastic. So I used to just love to go to Wales and cook on Julia's aga.
Well, all these years reading English novels, I thought it was just a brand name, that it was just a stove like anything else, like calling it the range or whatever. But no, apparently not. So
It's an English thing. It's like the Queen or something.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I first heard of an aga, even though I did live in England for 3 years. I'm not sure. Well, maybe I had read this before that, but no, I had lived there for 3 years and still really was not familiar with an aga. But I was reading a very British novel, I can't remember what, and the aga kept coming up, but nobody explained what it was. I didn't know if it was a form of a pet to her, but it was so central to the novel that I was with my British friend at the time, and I asked her to explain to me what it was. So I've always been kind of amused by the, how meaningful and central to family life the aga is in England. And I have it as a kind of comic element in my novel, which I'm afraid if I explain it, everyone will go screaming into the night, because it's really a very dark comic thread in the book. So I'll leave it at that. But
I can't wait to read that.
yeah, but hilarious. I mean, one of the funniest things in the book. I won't spoil it, but there is a character who can't stay away from this topic for some reason.
He doesn't want to talk about it, and it keeps coming up and haunting him. And the solar eclipse, I mean, we were writing at the same time period. I think probably anybody writing in 2017 probably has a little bit of solar eclipse in there. And, it's a sort of similar, for similar reasons. It's kind of, it's bookending Charlottesville, which I hadn't quite realized until I looked at the timeline. I knew I had both of those events in my head, but I wasn't sure why. And it's about 10 days later. So, it's kind of low-hanging fruit in symbolism terms of this darkness and this light. And it, at the end of the novel, I have all of the characters gathering on a rooftop to watch the solar eclipse. And I kind of struggled with that ending, because I wanted it to be a kind of pivotal moment where this epiphany of, there is light at the end of the tunnel, but in this case, there really isn't politically. So I struggled with those closing lines to kind of couch it into still being uplifting, but not really the end of the story.
And of course, you don't want a book that can only be read at a specific political moment, right? By the time it came out, things might think, it might read a little differently.
Right. Although it was interesting to give myself this very finite timeline of 10 days, because things really did change. I have a character, the aga obsessed character, in fact, is a poet who's been canceled, but canceled wasn't in our lexicon. It wasn't part of the conversation. It was just that he'd behaved kind of appallingly, and people didn't really know what to do with his work. So it was kind of interesting, even as I was writing it, to keep looking back on that moment just before the Me Too moment came onto the consciousness.
Like before we really had a lot of political vocabulary for this.
Yes.
The literary, you were managing it through the story.
Yes.
Well, which actually brings me to another question. This is more about content than form, I guess. I guess I'll start by starting with Delia on this one. I was thinking, reading the most recent memoir, the memoir that includes, I mean, it's not just about your illness, but that's certainly a very large part of it. And I know I've read people say, without, rather grimly, that, if the great new literary form of the 20th century was the prison camp memoir, then the one after that was the illness memoir, that until maybe 20, 30 years ago, people didn't write these descriptions of their medical odysseys. And then it became, it was all sort of terra incognita. You go into the hospital or whatever, and no one writes about that stuff. There's no vocabulary for it fictionally. And now it's kind of it's not an unusual form. I mean, did you feel like you were writing in that form, or doing something different that hadn't been done with it?
I knew, well, I got my bone marrow transplant. What happened to me was my husband died in 2015. A year later, I met Peter in a rather extraordinary way because my internet crashed and I got in a big battle with Verizon, and I had to, in order to control my rage, I had to write a funny piece about it. So I was published in the Times, and I got a ton of mail because everyone hates their phone companies. And I heard from Peter, and then it was very magical. Peter and I fell in love, and 5 months later, I got diagnosed with leukemia, and that began a 2 years before I was pronounced cured. I mean, I went through experimental treatment, and I was in remission. Then it came back, and my Dr. Robo said, there's only one thing that can save you, and it's a bone marrow transplant. So 2022, February, no, 2020, okay, I go to my doctor, and he says, it worked, basically you've survived, because you can get it back again after you survive this whole bone marrow transplant. It can come back. And it was now 2 years from then. And he said, and that was February. In March, COVID hit. So I went from that moment into COVID. And by the way, the whole time when you have leukemia and when you have a bone marrow transplant, your white count is so low that, I hadn't been to the theater, I hadn't been to a restaurant. So it was then even more of that, all right? And at that point, I knew that I had a book. I knew it because everything big had happened to me in 4 years. And it wasn't just the illness. It was the loss of Jerry, experiencing that, the loss of Nora before that, and then this just remarkable love affair that was just extraordinary. I read our emails to each other, and I knew they were beautiful. Peter's a nice writer. And then I knew that I was going to that I then got hit with this terrible thing. And because of Peter, as well as my doctors, I survived it. I knew I had everything you could ever want for a book: love, loss, and friendship. It's so much about girlfriend friendship, this book as well. And so I'm just looking at this, and I did not think of it as illness. I thought of it as this collection of amazing materials: love, loss, friendship, survival, against odds. It was like life handed me a story.
Yeah. The title,
The weird thing was that in order to write about the illness, when I was very sick, I had not a lot of memory from that time. And so I had to interview all my girlfriends and guy friends about what they experienced. And so it also became a treasure hunt for these amazing, strange things. Like, I was in the ICU 6 days, and I have no memory of it to this minute. I do not even know what an ICU looks like. And Meredith said to me, well, you were in the ICU and you went crazy in the ICU. You were swearing at everyone, and it's not really my nature to do that. So I was kind of excited about that. Because, you're the center of attention in the hospital, but you have no power. So it's a very powerless thing. And so I thought, oh, good. I expressed something. I got mad. Although Peter just said it was steroid overload. So he didn't think it was as exciting as I did. But the point is, I had this amazing story, and there was so much love in it and so much friendship in it that I knew I had something to write. And I did not think of it as an illness memoir, although I knew that Dr. Robos was a fantastic character, that she wasn't wrong about Julia Roberts, although I'm not sure that's exactly right either. But you know what I mean, that she has a kind of pizzazz.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she's very special. So I could see, I mean, the writer in me was just taking what had happened to me and started just making something out of it. And I have to say, I really enjoyed writing that book, you know, and it is full of so much pain. And yet, you know, I sent for my hospital records. I had 6,000 pages. I did not get through, that was in-house hospital records. I only got to about 4,000, but it was, you know, and I guess I didn't think about, oh, people are writing this, I should write this, or people are writing that. I just knew that Left on 10th, and I knew what the title was. I knew I had a book. I knew I had a great story, and that it happened to me.
Mm-hmm.
And there were so many weird things. I mean, there was this moment before Peter wrote me, I was invited to speak at a conference of Jungians in Texas. And I thought, what's a Jungian? I better meet one and find out. And then lo and behold, his email arrives in my inbox, which is not unlike what, you know, the incident with the lion. You know, there were magical things that, and he was a doctor. I mean, who else could help me through this but a doctor? And not only that, a psychiatrist, so a doctor of the heart and soul. How marvelous is that? You know what I mean? It was like, and it was the worst thing that ever happened to me, getting leukemia and going through that. It was absolutely unimaginably debilitating and scary and just frightening. And when I was through it, I couldn't stand up. I had to learn to walk again. I had to be, you know, so to write this was such a joy.
What's interesting,
it was a triumph over it.
Yeah, well, to transfigure it like that and to turn it into something else. What's most interesting about that is, and I'm sorry if the question sounded in any way dismissive, because it wasn't intended that way at all, about the illness memoir, but obviously there's so much shaping involved, and then it's invisible. You know, this comes across as completely straightforward and narrative and just almost like a diary, and yet so much shaping is involved and so much sort of working the material from, you know, as you say.
Well, I'm a dramatist, and I know about that, and I always need to turn the page. I mean, that's a big thing with me as a writer. So, yeah, I mean, I could take my skills to this. And I hope it did seem like that, you know, you can't really see that, but
right.
Which I knew.
Yeah, I would say that, I mean, I wasn't kidding when I said I just spent 3 days on the porch reading. I put everything else I was supposed to be doing aside because you really did pace it. It has a structure as well as a gripping story. And it is, on the one hand, clearly an illness memoir, and yet I didn't really think of it that way at all myself. It's just so uplifting.
I think it's a love story. That's what I think.
Yeah.
And I had to categorize it. Yeah. That's what I would say.
Yeah. I was also so moved at the end when you went and found the bone marrow donor. I didn't know a story like that would affect me the way it did, but this woman that you found and just her answers to why she did this were really remarkable and life affirming.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing, isn't it? I mean, she was 25 when she registered to be a bone marrow transplant donator. And I guess her mother's a nurse. And she said to me, you know, I mean, everyone should do this, she said. And she's just a lovely person living on the Gulf Coast of Florida, you know, very unassuming. She said, I said, do you want to do any publicity? No, I don't want, you know, she didn't want any of that, but she has been darling. She was so helpful and so nice.
And she saved someone's life. Wow.
Yeah, she did. She said she wants to do it again. So I'm sure she probably registered again.
Wow. Nice. So I want to go back because you gave me sort of the perfect segue to talk about screenwriting and the movies. But just before I do that, I wanted to ask Susan, I had a version of that question about content for you too, because you've you you know, you wrote a comic novel about the college admissions process, which, as with Beach Week, it seemed like it cut a little close to the bone. But I was thinking that these are not things that typically get I mean, it's the child rearing, the child rearing in suburbia in this particular milieu. Did this seem to you like sort of unmined territory, like that this was something that no one had really shaped before?
I don't think that it's unmined territory, because there are a number of books about that out there. But for me, I think a lot of what informed those two novels and the one that came before it, which was called Rockville Pike, which was a kind of meditation on suburbia and sprawl and the DC suburbs, was because I had moved back here. I was kind of thrust into adult life at a late stage. I'd been living overseas for a long time, where life was very different and easier in many ways, and sort of taken care of financially by a company, and just suddenly being in the suburbs with 3 children, feeling kind of broke and not understanding this culture. I really didn't understand what was going on around me. Even in the schools, just the level of competition and these intense parents. And I had been very mellow and put my kids into British public school thinking, it doesn't matter. They're just going to absorb the culture, which they did. And I have no regrets, but they came into the American very competitive school system pretty behind in things like math. And so just the kind of, I don't think I would have seen any of that if I had come up through the system, if I'd been living in one place for my whole life. But coming, to a place like Rockville, Maryland, and driving up and down this commercial strip and seeing, Bagel City and, a giant furniture store. This was a visualization novel, in that I went to visit the graveyard where F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald are buried, and it's very moving. People still to this day leave champagne and candles and little notes, and it's a really profound experience. And then you look up and you see a giant discount furniture store across the street, and I was like, this is a novel. I don't know what the story is, but I need to capture this landscape. So all of that I would not have seen if I had stayed put. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I've rambled on.
It's a better question than I might have. You answered it. Yeah. So let's go back quickly to I know we're getting near the end of our time, but I did want to talk a little bit about movies and screenwriting. And I know, Delia, obviously you've written a lot of famous screenplays, including, I think the one that Suzanne didn't mention was Sleepless in Seattle, which is very well known, that you did with your sister. And I know, Susan, at least one of your books also was adapted for a TV movie. So let me ask you guys, like, what happens to stories when they become movies? What changes them?
Well, a book isn't a movie.
Right.
So you have to find the movie in the book, and it isn't until that moment when if you're adapting your own work, where you suddenly leave it behind, that you understand that you've accomplished it, in the screenwriting process. But there's so many rules about screenwriting, if you observe them, in 15 minutes, you have to have, the essential conflict has to begin within 15 minutes. There's the rules. I think they're really useful for writing, because the drama, it's about drama and conflict. So you have to have stakes, you have to have conflict, you have to have drama. Really, novels don't need to have almost any of those things if the writing is interesting. I think a book is better when it has conflict, because it's the definition of drama, and I like books that have drama, but I'm sure there are books that don't really have that kind of drama, not the way I like to structure it. If you're a screenwriter, it gets into your novel writing, it's how you think about things. I don't, it's, first of all, a movie isn't a script. A book is a book and a movie isn't a script.
Mm.
So you have written something that then a whole bunch of other people are going to interpret, especially the actors and the director. And you are also often going to be thrown off it. And someone else is going to be hired to write it, so that your ownership is not even clear. There's so much rage in screenwriters that you can't even believe it. I mean, I wrote books because I could see what a difficult world that was.
Mhm.
And that if I needed my own voice as a writer, I needed to have books.
Mhm.
So you don't even know, if you're looking at credits, whether the writer is actually the writer, because the Writers Guild has rules. I don't have a credit on Sleepless in Seattle. There were 2 writers until before Nora came on, then Nora came on, then I came on. And most of the work I did was, 1, it was with her, and 2, it was a lot to do with dialogue and character. And that does not get you a credit. Structure is what gets you credits. And truthfully, that's the right thing. And it favors the earlier writers. They're so different, you know, and I'm always saying to screenwriters, write something else, write a play, write a book, do something else so that you have your own voice,
Mhm.
you know, but, you know.
You know, I wrote down a quote from you, and I wasn't even sure if there'd be an opportunity to use it, but I just thought it was so fabulous that I couldn't resist. And it's in reference to this. You say, every screenwriter is a collaborator, not in the good sense of the word, more like Vichy and the Germans in World War II.
It's
Love that.
true. I mean, you collaborate with people who then betray you, and then hire another person. I mean, I'm close to I have one producer friend who's fired me, and we're still friends, you know, because I don't know. It's just what's done there. It's, you know, writers are the lowest people on the, but it's a much more practical thing. It's a blueprint for a film.
Mhm.
And a film is a collaboration. And one of the great things about a book is it's just your voice. I mean, what Susan describes is her voice, what she sees in the world, what she experienced when she moved her kids back to Maryland. I mean, that is, you know, I mean, she could write that as a screenplay and say, we don't want to do Maryland. We want to do Los Angeles. Well, I mean, like you really could substitute, but that's the kind of thing that you would just be told. I don't want him to be a truck driver. I want him to fly an airplane.
So was that,
you know, like that.
Yeah. So was that your experience, Susan, of the novel that you wrote that was made into a TV movie?
I did not try to write the screenplay. I think I knew a little bit of I'm not even sure how I knew that, just hearing friends or reading books about the screenwriting process, but also, you know, I feel like I'm fortunate to be able to figure out how to write a novel, and I don't know how to write a screenplay. So I was not part of the process. I was a consultant, and I was shown the script at the end and made a few suggestions, but those were very technical things to do with the college admissions process. So it was kind of amazing to watch what the screenwriter did with the material. I was impressed. It wouldn't have occurred to me. I think I would have been too close to the material to be able to sort of pull one character out and have that. I haven't watched it in many years, but I believe that they kind of narrated it through the voice of one of the characters and had her telling the whole story, which wouldn't have occurred to me. And they did a better job with it than I would have been able to. I did work on a play of my first novel with a playwright, and we did it together, and that was really fun. Nothing much ever came of that. We had a reading at the Page to Stage Kennedy Center, and it felt like maybe one of the highlights of my life, just to watch these actors reading the script, and I thought it was very good, but nothing came of it.
I just want to say about those readings with actors, they are as wonderful as anything you could ever experience in life, really. It's just to have your, you know, actors sit around and read your script.
Yeah.
I love reading. They're magical, and they only happen once. You just happen to be, you know, you're there and you experienced it, and the actors don't have costume, they don't have anything, and you just see the talent. It's thrilling.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing about screenwriting is it provides a glamour that book published, and and an excitement. It isn't really just glamour. There are these magical moments that are amazing.
Wow. So I think we have time for one more question, and it's good that you can answer it short if you want, no pressure. But since it's Moment, I do sometimes like to sprinkle in a question with a little Jewish content usually at the end. And we've done a couple of big features in Moment about sort of what makes a Jewish joke and what are the great Jewish jokes and what is Jewish humor. To state the obvious, I wouldn't classify either of you offhand as a Jewish humorist or a Jewish writer, but do you see any influence in your work from sort of Jewish culture or Judaism generally? I mean, I notice all your characters are Jewish, Susan, but they don't make anything particular of it. But
I think this new book, Bookish People, is the first time that I kind of leaned into that, in part, again, because of Charlottesville. I wanted my protagonist to be reacting as a Jewish woman to the anti-Semitism around her. And I also think part of that I will contribute to my marriage, because I've now married someone who came from the Soviet Union and speaks Yiddish and Russian and tells me a million jokes a day, and I've absorbed all of these jokes, and a lot of the Jewish humor and the Yiddish jokes found their way into the novel. So it definitely influenced me in this book. But what is a Jewish writer? I know that's like a conversation for another 90-minute
10 seconds, right? Yeah. Delia, I'll let you clean up on this, and then we'll go to questions.
I just think that the culture that I grew up with was books and humor and writing. And my mother was obsessed with books. She was so proud that we had bookshelves in every room of the house, and she would always, so I think, and humor is part of the Jewish culture. And that is really the only, so I mean, I don't think my humor is Jewish, but there's no question I grew up in a house that valued it.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, we have 10 minutes left, and I'm going to throw this back to Suzanne in case there are any questions. And I'm going to mute.
Great. Thank you all for that fabulous, fabulous conversation. It was really, really wonderful. I'm going to step into the humor question about, do either of you consider yourself to be a funny person? And do people expect you to be funny because of some of your work?
I do think of myself as a funny person, and I do think that, I don't know if people expect it, but I hope it's something that people like about me. That's all.
I do not think of myself as a funny person. Sometimes people tell me that I am, but I feel like it takes me a while to craft the humor. So it's not really I could never be a stand-up comedian. It's not rolling off my tongue. It's not, it takes me a while.
I could never be a stand-up comedian. Oh my God. Please do not think for my answer. I meant that.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother thing.
Thank you. Somebody would like, Delia, for you to explain the meaning behind the title of your new book, Left of 10th.
Left on 10th. I live on 10th Street. So left in Greenwich Village, and if you're going down 5th Avenue or 7th in a car, left on 10th is my way home. I was left on 10th when my husband died, and after that, life took many left turns, some miraculous, some terrifying, and my book is about all of them.
Thank you. When sitting down to create a piece of fiction, do you know at the beginning what the ending will be?
I don't actually. I know everything there is to know that I can know at the beginning. I know what their lives were before this book begins. I know when they were born and where they were born. I know some of the things about what their passions were when they were children. I know what their complications are of the characters. I know what the subject matter. I knew at Syracuse that I was sending 2 couples on a trip, and that one of the couples the man had an affair with the woman before the marriage that they have now to other people. So I knew there was history there. I knew there was going to be something awful happening in Syracuse. I wasn't absolutely sure what. I knew a ton of things, but I thought I was writing a book that would end up in a detective's office. And I suddenly realized about halfway through that this was a book about marriage, and that everything that had to do in it was within the marriages, and that it wasn't a quote detective story. But I need to know a lot before I begin what the conflicts are, what the history is, and what the book's about. But what actually is going to happen, that starts to tell me that as it goes along. How about you, Susan?
Well, that's very reassuring to hear. I have a similar answer, and it's causing me a lot of anxiety right now because I'm supposed to turn a new book in December, and I don't outline. I know what the story is, but it's taking me a long time to figure this out, and it's a lot of pages are sitting on my editor's desk, and I haven't heard anything if she's out there somewhere. So I'm very nervous that, but I know it's not there yet because I wish I could outline, but I can't. I have a real vision of what the story is. It just takes me a while to figure it out. And I'm reminding myself that it does for every book. I'm not a book a year kind of writer. I admire people who can do that, but it takes me a lot longer.
Amy, I think you have another question.
Oh, this is sort of silly. I see that this is kind of a point of privilege here. I see that an acquaintance of mine posted a question that might seem like ancient history to Delia, and it's about a set of books that which was the basis of my acquaintance with this person, and I think with a whole lot of other women. And this is the fact that in You've Got Mail, the Betsy Tacy books are prominently featured, the series, and right. So this friend of mine, Carla Kozak, just wanted to know if you were of the Sisterhood of
huge Betsy Tacy person. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Nora and I did like to do was always to find things in movies that were personal to us to make them better. And of course, that she owned a children's bookstore. That was one of the first decisions we made because we were raised on children's books and we loved them. And the Betsy Tacy books are in there. I think there's a reference to Anne of Green Gables, and the shoe books, the English shoe books by Noel Streatfeild, Dancing Shoes. And yeah, those are all passions of ours.
That's great.
Thank you. And actually, I know you talked a little bit about how you both try not to, in your novels, be true to form for characters, but do you find that family and friends still insist that they're in the book and you've written about them?
I once had a neighbor come up to me and say that she thought I might have based a character in the novel on her, but I didn't because they had different kinds of dogs. So I was kind of relieved by how easy it can be to change up details and have people not see themselves because of that. So I haven't had a lot of that, every once in a while it might happen, but I really try hard to not have it skew that close to life.
The bookstore book, Bookish People, kind of threw me when I was first reading it because obviously the characters are made up, but the books, about half of them are real books by real authors, which is very unnerving. They came out in 2017 and then the rest of them are made up, so. Yeah.
Well, also unnerving, some booksellers made a really lovely gathering for me Sunday. And some of the people I'd worked with when I first began working at the bookstore 11 years ago were there. And one of them read a page aloud that she thought echoed her words. And she's probably right. She was amused and flattered by it, I think. But, sometimes I absorb things that I'm not aware I'm absorbing. So.
How about with you, Delia?
No, I mean, I certainly, no, I don't, let me, God, this is so mystifying to me. There's no question that hanging up, I mean, that Georgia, the phenomenally successful older sister, is some, I'm definitely mining Nora and me in that book. There's not any question about that. So, but not really. There's 3 sisters and I'm one of 4 sisters actually. And, but I mean, there's things, but I don't think I've ever actually, in fiction, borrowed a character. But I have borrowed details out of people, or people who make me feel certain ways when I'm with them, or somebody who has a very magical attitude toward, going down the street, and tends to make friends with everyone. I've used details out of people's lives that I've observed. Because that's what writers do, but no, not anything specific.
Right, because everything's material. Do either of you wake up in the middle of the night with a story idea?
Well, when I woke up from that dream where I dreamt that whole novel, I dreamt The Lion Is In. I, had a dream about a bar in North Carolina with 3 women, one in a wedding dress, and there was a lion, and they were different ages. One woman was older and the 2 others were younger. And I just woke up and, I just dreamed a novel, and I knew the title. So yeah, that has happened to me. But I've also gone to sleep and said, you have to dream. I have this YA book I'm really fond of called Franny in Pieces that I wrote. And I didn't have a title for it. And I went to sleep one night. I said, you're going to dream this title. And I did. I woke up in the morning with it. So, things can happen at night. I mean, I wanted to dream about my late husband because, you can be with someone in a dream. I mean, a dream, a person can be real. And then I dreamt, I went to sleep and I dreamt he walked into the room and he said, I want a divorce. This is after he died. This is in my book, Left on 10th. And I said, what? And he said, yeah, I want a divorce. I'm leaving you. And I said, well, we can just talk, can't we? I mean, I can just come in the room and talk to you, can't I? And he said, no. And he left. And I woke up in just a state of complete shock. I mean, was that Jerry? Did he come to tell me he didn't want to be with me anymore? And then I thought, for days I thought about it. And then I thought, no, this is my dream. I dreamt it. And he's telling me he's no longer in my life anymore. Get used to it. It was about 5 months after Jerry died that I had that dream. And it was really stunning and so upsetting. But things can happen when you fall asleep, I guess. So I guess I don't think it was him. I think I was telling myself that I had to move on.
Wow.
Susan?
Yeah, I don't have quite as magical an experience, but I do some problem solving at night without realizing it or meaning to. I generally sleep very well, but I love sleeping. But when I do wake up fretting in the middle of the night, occasionally I find it's productive time. I can often just get myself to another, advance a plot point or untangle some mess. So yeah, it is. It's good in that sense to just sometimes walk away from what you're working on. And it's not really, you think that you're being lazy by taking a walk or watching a movie or doing something else, but that's when problems solve themselves often.
Great. So we do have to wrap up, but I want to leave with one more question. What advice do you both have for those who would like to tackle writing their own novel?
I would say, write what's inside. Don't say, oh, people like to read about vampires. Maybe I can write that. Your writing is your fingerprint. So figure out what your fingerprint is, what it is you understand, what stories you have to tell. So go inside for what's true, not outside.
Yeah, I would give a similar answer. And I would also say, if you do want to write about, say, vampires, don't be afraid to do that because there's a gazillion vampire books out there because your fingerprint is your own and you will write your own unique book. and also to read. You know, I'm often so surprised. It doesn't happen often, but in my classes, when I ask people what they're reading, every once in a while, someone will say, I don't read because I don't really want to interfere with my creative process. But I find, you know, everything I've learned about writing is from reading. So read voraciously.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of you, Delia, Susan, Amy, for this wonderful, wonderful afternoon. I want to encourage everyone to purchase Susan's book, Bookish People, that comes out in August. And Delia's book, Left on 10th, is already out, and you can purchase that. There have been links placed in the chat for everybody, and we will be sending out a link later this week with a recording as well, a link to the recording as well as a link to the books. I also want to thank and congratulate one more time our fiction contest winners, Anne Schott and Hillel Damron, and a special thank you to Sharon Karmazin, Dina Elkins, and the Karma Foundation for their support of this short fiction contest. We cannot do this without you. And I want to remind everyone that the next submission for the 2022 contest is due on August 15th, and you can find more information at momentmag.com. Again, a link was put into the chat, and I will include that in the follow-up email. I also want to remind everyone you can visit Moment's shop page on our website, where you can download Good Karma free of charge this week using the code KARMA, K-A-R-M-A, all lowercase, where you can read a selection of some of our past winners for the contest. So again, Delia, Susan, Amy, thank you all. Thank everybody. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and we will see everybody next time. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much.
you.
It's really a joy, Susan and Amy. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.